Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are opening a door into a period of history that I think is often overlooked.
Definitely.
But its collapse, I mean, the dramatic collapse of this dynasty reshaped the map of France forever. We're going deep on a king whose time on the throne barely lasted a year.
Not even, really.
Right. Yet his life marked the spectacular and critically childless end of one of the greatest royal lines of the early Middle Ages.
We are talking about Louis V, King of West Francia. And, we were really talking about the final sputtering flame of the Carolingian dynasty in the Western Kingdom.
Exactly. Now, Louis V is probably best known, if he is known at all, by a nickname that is, well, it's historically brutal, Louis le Fainéant.
Louis the Do-Nothing, or Louis the Sluggard.
It's such an unflattering label. It implies that for the year he ruled, nothing of consequence happened, and he was basically just a passenger in his own kingdom.
And it's an easy nickname to adopt, but as we unpack the sources, you realize the irony is that Louis V was perhaps the most active catalyst in French history.
How so?
Purely through his vulnerability and his sudden removal from the scene. His failure, or maybe his inability to govern, was so absolute that it forced the kingdom to fundamentally change how it chose its rulers.
That sets a perfect stage for our deep dive today. Our mission is to analyze the sources covering his incredibly short, turbulent, undisputed reign, just over a year, from 986 to 987.
Right.
And to understand how his death created this definitive vacuum that allowed the next great French royal line, the Capetians, to just emerge. We're looking at a hyper-condensed moment of dynastic collapse.
And it is so brief. Let's ground ourselves in the basic facts because the timeline is, well, just incredibly short. Louis V was born around 966 or 967.
So he was incredibly young, barely an adult when he took sole power.
Exactly. His rule, from his father's death on March 2, 986, until his own death on May 22, 987, was just over 14 months. He died aged only 20 or 21.
And the sources are pretty clear that his youth and his inexperience meant he was never really in control.
Not at all.
They state pretty plainly that during his brief reign, the powerful regional nobility essentially ruled the country. And that right there is the ultimate signal of a dynasty in collapse.
It is the core diagnosis of what you could call the Carolingian illness. You have to remember, this line was founded by Charlemagne. It carried this immense, centuries-old legitimacy.
But by the late 10th century, that legitimacy
was hollowed out completely. Louis V was the final link. His inherited weakness directly paved the way for the rise of Hugh Capet. We are witnessing a geopolitical shift from the inheritance of blood to the necessity of, well, proven competence.
Okay, let's unpack this with some immediate context. To understand the chaos Louis V inherited, we have to trace his lineage. He wasn't born into failure, was he? He was born into great political hype, but it was a hype defined by conflict.
That's right.
So let's move into his youth, co-reign, and his incredibly complex lineage.
Well, Louis V was the son of King Lothair of France, the Carolingian ruler of West Francia, and his mother was Queen Emma of Italy. So right away, that tells you his pedigree was designed for power projection.
But the truly fascinating element is his mother's side.
Absolutely.
Oh.
His mother, Emma, was the daughter of King Lothair II of Italy and the immensely powerful Empress Adelaide.
That maternal connection is fascinating because it fundamentally compromises his position, doesn't it? The Carolingians in West Francia were constantly trying to push back against the Ottonian Empire in the east.
The Saxon dynasty, yeah.
But Louis V was literally half Ottonian by heritage, tied through his powerful grandmother, Empress Adelaide.
Precisely. And that duality, being Carolingian by crown but tied to the Ottonians by blood, it defined his entire short life. It created the internal contradictions that tore his court apart. The sources suggest Queen Emma and her mother, Adelaide, they saw the alliance with the Eastern Empire as the only source of stability for the fragile West Frankish kingdom.
So how acute was that tension? I mean, in the West Frankish court during his youth, was his mother, Queen Emma, seen as an outsider, or was that alliance an accepted political reality?
Oh, she was a very contentious figure. Alliances through marriage were normal, of course, but Emma's commitment to the Ottonian vision, a stable, imperialized Europe, it put her at loggerheads with the traditional Carolingian expansionists.
The ones who still wanted Lotharingia back.
The ones who still clung to the dream of regaining Lotharingia and restoring Charlemagne's full empire. Emma represented the party of retreat and stability, which was anathema to the more aggressive, powerful regional lords.
So before he inherits this complete mess, his father, Lothair, is trying to shore up the dynasty's future. The sources say Louis was associated with the government by Lothair in 978.
Associating the heir with the throne was a necessary survival tactic in the late 10th century. It was an attempt to ensure continuity, to preemptively settle any succession disputes among the ambitious nobility.
And it happened quickly.
Very. He was formally crowned co-king on June 8, 979, at the Abbey of Saint-Cornet in Compiègne.
A 12 or 13-year-old crowned co-king, that speaks volumes about the fragility of the whole system. They just couldn't afford to wait for Lothair's death.
And we have to note the central figure in that ceremony, Archbishop Adalbert of Rheims. This powerful churchman placed the crown on Louis V's head.
And this is significant because
Adalbert, as we'll discuss, owed his appointment and his primary political loyalty not to the Carolingian king he just crowned, but to the Ottonian emperor, Otto I.
So Louis V starts his life already indebted to and crowned by a man whose loyalty lay with his dynastic rivals. That is just setting the stage for disaster.
Absolutely.
Okay, so moving past his co-reign, Lothair makes the next move on Louis's behalf, a purely political marriage designed to save the dynasty, but which became, well, the catastrophic political marriage.
It was an arrangement born of pure desperation. The Carolingians had been losing ground to the powerful Robertians, led by Hugh Capet, for decades. They needed a massive counterweight.
And Lothair thought he could find it in the south.
He did.
And what were the precise political goals here? What was driving this desperate union?
There were two major goals, both centered on Hugh Capet. First, they wanted to restore Carolingian royal power in the far south of the kingdom, specifically in Aquitaine, which was, well, it was largely autonomous.
And the second goal?
The second, and this is the direct confrontation, was to get the active military support of the powerful southern lords. The marriage was arranged by King Lothair and Count Geoffrey I of Anjou, and the whole point was to get the houses of Anjou and Toulouse on their side to confront Hugh Capet's growing dominance in the north.
So it's a strategy to encircle Hugh Capet. You press him from the south with these new Aquitaine forces while holding the center in the north. It's a brilliant strategy if the marriage holds.
A magnificent blueprint that was immediately rendered useless by the sheer mismatch of the participants.
Let's get into that. The 15-year-old Louis was married to
Adelaide-Blanche of Anjou, and the sources consistently place her age around 40.
40. A 25-year difference. She wasn't just older, she was a seasoned political operator.
Oh, absolutely. Adelaide-Blanche was the sister of Count Geoffrey III and already twice a widow from very politically advantageous marriages to Count Stephen of Gévaudan and Count Raymond of Toulouse, Prince of Gothia.
So she was marrying a crown, not a prince. She brought vast territories, deeply entrenched family alliances, and immense personal experience in managing regional power.
Exactly. Louis was just the vehicle through which her family, the Angevin, could project influence into the royal court and, gain the title of queen for their sister.
Given that the main function of a royal marriage was to produce an heir and cement an alliance, was Louis's father, Lothair, criticized by any of the chroniclers for this? I mean, for arranging such a disastrous age gap, did anyone see this was a recipe for failure?
That is the essential question, isn't it? The sources tend to focus their critique on the consequences, the lack of a child, Louis's youthfulness, rather than on Lothair's flawed strategy itself.
So they blame the outcome, not the plan.
Pretty much. Lothair was operating in an emergency. He needed political and military alliances now, and Adelaide-Blanche was the only package deal that brought the kind of power base he needed in the south. So he prioritized immediate military necessity over long-term dynastic continuity.
But still, marrying a 40-year-old widow to a 15-year-old boy, that immediately signals that the survival of the dynasty was secondary to the tactical need to confront Hugh Capet.
Absolutely. And the plan moved ahead anyway. In 982, right after the wedding, Louis and Adelaide-Blanche were crowned king and queen of Aquitaine by her own brother, Bishop Guy of Le Puy.
An attempt to establish this parallel Carolingian kingdom in the south, free of Robertian influence.
And it failed. Spectacularly. It burned down the entire strategic blueprint. Richarus, the chronicler, gives us extraordinary, almost scandalous detail on the incompatibility of the couple.
Let's delve into Richarus's account. He painted a picture of a total diplomatic breakdown, not just a failed marriage.
Richarus confirms they were unable to live peacefully together from the very start. He notes they had almost no conjugal love, and he attributes this to the age gap and Louis's frivolity because of his youth.
He also mentions Louis didn't have a proper tutor to instill discipline.
Right, which is a subtle attempt by the chronicler to blame the young king rather than the structural weakness of the dynasty itself.
But the physical separation he describes is even more telling, isn't it? It says so much about the political rift. They did not share a common bedroom as they could not bear it, and the detail about their conversations.
Yes, that's the detail that sticks with you. When traveling, they took a separate residence each, and any state communication was limited to conversations in the open air and were never long, but only lasted for a few words.
Conversing in the open air, that strongly suggests an absolute lack of trust. They couldn't even share counsel privately.
It wasn't partnership. It was two rival political entities forced to share a temporary title.
So after 2 childless, miserable years, the inevitable happened in 980. The union was dissolved.
The alliance had failed, the South was not secured, and the opportunity to produce an heir was completely gone.
And the story of the annulment, as told by Rodolphus Glaber, is just essential because it shows Adelaide's competence and Louis's political weakness.
Glaber paints Adelaide as a complete mastermind. She adroitly convinced the young prince to make a trip back to her home province of Aquitaine. The narrative suggests she was worried that simply divorcing him would jeopardize her own hereditary rights to certain lands.
So she used the king's legitimacy to secure her own territory first. A brilliant move.
Precisely. Louis V, who is described as being without suspecting the artifice, he just yielded to her advice and went with her. Once they were safely in Aquitaine, where her family power was absolute,
She just abandoned him.
she just left him there, secured her own rights, and returned to her own family, the Angevin. And then, almost immediately, she married Count William I of Provence, forging a new, stable regional alliance completely independent of the collapsing Carolingian center.
He walked right into a political ambush orchestrated by his own wife. The damage wasn't just personal. It confirmed to Hugh Capet and every other ambitious lord that the Carolingian dynasty couldn't even manage its own strategic alliances.
Let alone govern the kingdom.
Exactly.
It signaled that the royal crown was just a useful temporary tool,
Mhm.
something easily discarded by local powers like Anjou when a better option came along. The failure was a public humiliation that accelerated the decline of royal authority.
And it left the Carolingian north completely exposed to the reversions.
Completely.
Now, you mentioned a fascinating piece of scholarship that complicates this otherwise perfect story of a scandalous failure.
Yes. Despite all the detail from contemporaries like Richterus and Glaber, the historian Carl Richard Bruhl recently challenged the actual existence of this marriage. He suggests the accounts might be heavily exaggerated or even invented.
That's a serious challenge to the record. If the marriage didn't happen, or if it wasn't as politically consequential as we're told, what does that say about the narrative we have?
It suggests the accepted narrative, the one that blames the young king's frivolity and the scandalous age difference, might itself have been crafted by later chroniclers to explain a much deeper structural failure.
Like King Lothair's incompetence in consolidating power.
Or the total inability of the dynasty to attract powerful southern allies. Look, regardless of whether Louis and Adelaide-Blanche actually hated sharing a bed, the political attempt to forge a southern alliance failed spectacularly. And that political failure remains the essential truth of the dynasty's decline.
That reframes the entire sequence. The story of personal failure might just be a cover for a systemic political weakness.
It highlights the challenge of studying the 10th century. You have to constantly read between the lines, acknowledging that even the most colorful stories often serve a political purpose, in this case, assigning blame to the young dead king.
Okay, let's leave the ghost of the Aquitaine marriage behind and move into the brief, chaotic period where Louis V was finally the undisputed king. The failure of his marriage severed his southern anchor, forcing him back north into a court now openly split by his father's death.
Right.
This brings us to the core of his rule. Factional warfare from 986 to 987.
Lothair's death on March 2, 986, instantly propelled Louis V into the role of sole king, and he inherited a court that wasn't just politically divided, it was violently at war with itself, split into two irreconcilable factions.
And we need to define these two factions clearly because they paralyzed his reign and ultimately dictated the final succession.
The first was the pro-Ottonian faction. This was led by Queen Emma, Louis's own mother, and Archbishop Adalberon of Reims. Their political goal was absolute, the renewal of friendly relationships with the Ottonian dynasty. They wanted peace and stability over expansion, and they were heavily influenced by the powerful Empress Adelaide, who was Emma's mother.
And the second faction, the anti-Ottonian faction, was the aggressive one, pushing the traditional Carolingian claims.
Correct. They were the expansionist party. Their goal was the continuation of Lothair's aggressive strategy, focusing entirely on seizing the critical territory of Lotharingia.
And they wanted to exploit the fact that the Holy Roman Emperor, Otto III, was still a child.
Exactly. He was represented by his mother, Empress Theophano. They saw an opportunity.
So this wasn't just about borders. This was a war over the very identity of the West Frankish kingdom. Should they be a stable, localized kingdom allied with the great empire, or should they pursue the risky, expansionist ambition of restoring a full Carolingian empire?
The Lotharingian conflict was the defining geopolitical struggle of the 10th century. Lotharingia, the Middle Kingdom, was culturally and strategically vital. It was a buffer zone and the historical heartland of the Carolingians. For the anti-Ottonian party, recovering it was a matter of dynastic honor and legitimacy.
But for the pro-Ottonian party, trying to seize it was a guaranteed devastating war.
Right. And this internal political war played out most intensely on the clerical battleground, specifically over the loyalty of the bishops.
This is a subtle but profound source of the royal weakness.
It is. The sources make it clear that Louis V inherited a conflict rooted in Emperor Otto Vuxter's policies. Otto Verkli, as the self-proclaimed defender of Rome, asserted the right to name and invest clergy in territories that were, theoretically, Carolingian.
Which means that powerful churchmen, like Archbishop Adalberon, held their position and their political anchor not from their king in Compiègne, but from the emperor across the Rhine.
Exactly. They were essentially foreign agents in the heart of the Frankish kingdom. Adalberon had been elevated by Otto I to the Archbishopric of Reims, a massively powerful and wealthy position. He was required to serve Louis V, but his true allegiance was to the empire. That made him and the entire pro-Ottonian faction an existential threat in the eyes of the expansionists. The kingdom was just riddled with these internal loyalty conflicts.
And initially, Queen Emma, Louis V's mother, dominated the court. She leveraged her powerful family connections to push the pro-Ottonian line, favoring peace and stability.
But this fragile dominance just collapsed, swiftly. In the summer of 986, there was a major political reversal. The aggressive anti-Ottonian party prevailed at court, likely through military intimidation or some successful maneuver among the great counts.
And the consequences of this internal coup were deeply humiliating for the Carolingians. The Queen Mother, Queen Emma, was forced to leave court entirely.
And where did she go for refuge? She was forced to flee to the protection of the one man who benefited most from the Carolingian collapse. Hugh Capet.
The Duke of the Franks and the primary Robertian rival.
The king's own mother seeking protection from his arch-rival.
Yeah.
I mean, it is an unparalleled demonstration of Louis V's utter lack of control over his court or even his own family's safety.
This reversal immediately put Archbishop Adalberon, the leader of the now defeated faction, in an impossible position. And this led to a full-blown crisis of loyalty that really defined the end of Louis's reign.
Adalberon was now isolated and viewed as a traitor by the triumphant anti-Ottonian faction. He was forced to flee his powerful episcopal seat in Reims, and his choice of refuge is highly significant. He took refuge in one of his fortresses on the Meuse River, firmly in Ottonian territory.
So the man who crowned Louis V, who was supposed to be his closest spiritual and political advisor, openly fled to enemy territory. That is the ultimate crisis of loyalty.
It is.
So how did Louis V, who was barely 20 years old, actually manage the political optics of this? His own mother and his archbishop seeking refuge with his main dynastic rival.
Well, Louis clearly perceived Adalberon's flight as treason, which you could argue it was. He was swayed by the aggressive anti-Ottonian faction to turn violently against the archbishop, and for a brief moment, the do-nothing king actually attempted to assert some strong royal authority.
He threatened a siege of Reims.
And planned a formal trial court at Compiègne to settle the matter.
That's a staggering commitment. To try and put the most powerful cleric in the kingdom who you know is supported by the Eastern Empire up on treason charges, that is not the action of a sluggard.
No. It suggests Louis V, or at least the faction controlling him, was making one final, desperate play for centralized power. It was a huge political gamble. If he succeeded, he might have broken the Ottonian grip on the clergy and asserted real sovereignty.
But the threat of an immediate civil war, complicated by a potential invasion from Empress Theophanu's imperial forces that hung over the entire kingdom, the stakes were astronomical.
They were.
And just as this confrontation was about to escalate into full-blown war, Louis had to choose between prosecuting his powerful cleric or risking an imperial invasion. The political winds shifted again.
Yes. In the spring of 987, at the 11th hour, Louis V had a change of heart. Or maybe the factional balance at court reversed again, realizing that internal conflict plus external war would be fatal. He sought reconciliation with Adelaide-Blanche. He canceled the planned trial.
And he also planned a critical peace meeting.
He was preparing to meet with Empress Theophano, who was ruling on behalf of the young Otto III. This was a final attempt to stabilize the volatile eastern border and at the same time pull the rug out from under the aggressive anti-Ottonian faction. It was a move towards stability and pragmatism.
So after 14 months of chaotic factional wars, a failed marriage, and a near-treason trial of his chief bishop, Louis V was finally on the verge of a decisive, potentially stabilizing diplomatic maneuver. He was beginning to act like a king.
He is attempting to salvage his inheritance.
And that is precisely when destiny intervened.
He was on the brink of making peace, of perhaps achieving some semblance of control, when the story takes its sudden, definitive, and fatal turn.
Which brings us to Section V, the sudden end and the Capetian dawn. Before any of these carefully planned peace talks or reconciliations could solidify, Louis V died on May 22, 987.
The sources attribute the cause of death to a fall while hunting. A simple contingent sporting accident in the forest of Halat, near Senlis. He was just 20 or 21 years old. It's a remarkable historical moment where a trivial accident ends not just a king's life, but an entire dynastic age.
If he had skipped hunting that day, or if he had just fallen slightly differently, the Carolingian dynasty might have endured for another generation.
It's the ultimate historical sliding doors moment.
It really is.
But he fell, and his death immediately created the single most critical fact that dominated the political landscape. Louis V left no legitimate heirs.
A complete succession vacuum. Who, then, was the logical hereditary nominee for the Frankish throne?
That would be Louis V's uncle, Charles, Duke of Lower Lorraine. He was the surviving male heir of the main Carolingian line, the last undisputed male descendant of Charlemagne holding a major title. By tradition and hereditary right, he should have been the next king.
But hereditary right was no longer enough in a kingdom ravaged by political infighting and external threats. And this is the precise moment the power brokers of West Francia stepped in and decreed that competence was now the greater virtue.
It was a clerical and noble coup, driven primarily by the need for stability. The clergy, especially the now reconciled Adalberon and Gerbert of Aurillac, who would later become Pope Sylvester II, they intervened decisively. These were sophisticated, internationally connected intellectuals who understood the catastrophic weakness of the Carolingian center.
And this intervention was explicitly framed as a choice between historical legitimacy and pragmatic ability. The argument was delivered by Adalberon himself.
The very man Louis V had just tried to prosecute for treason.
Oh.
Adalberon gathered the nobility and delivered this famous oration arguing eloquently for the election of Hugh Capet. It's one of the most powerful and consequential speeches in French history.
If they weren't arguing for bloodline, what was the core of that political argument?
Well, Adalberon first gave a brief nod to legitimacy. He confirmed that Hugh Capet was of royal blood, so the transition didn't seem revolutionary. But the core of the argument was devastatingly pragmatic. They rejected Charles of Lorraine, the hereditary heir, because he lacked the necessary political capital and military competence to save the realm.
And what did Hugh Capet possess that Charles didn't?
Hugh Capet, the Robertian, had, in Adalberon's words, proven himself through his actions and his military might. And this is the pivot point. The argument was that the kingdom needed a strong, proven military leader and administrator who could command the loyalty of the great counts, not just a weak figurehead relying on an inherited, failing title.
So this essentially reframed the role of the French monarchy. They were no longer looking for a sacred inherited ruler, but for a competent, proven defender, a kind of chief executive officer of the kingdom.
That's a good way to put it.
So why did Charles of Lorraine, despite his heritage, fail to meet this threshold of competence?
Charles was powerful, yes, but his power base was Lower Lorraine, which was often seen as being too closely tied to the Ottonian sphere.
The same imperial connection that had just torn Louis V's court apart.
Exactly. Choosing Charles would have meant continuing the very factional war that had crippled Louis V. Capet, however, was the Duke of the Franks. He held immense centralized power in the vital region between the Seine and the Loire. His military strength was localized, proven, and independent of the empire.
So the nobility and the church weren't just choosing a new family, they were choosing a new political model. Stability and effective local control over the chaos of international dynastic claims.
The Carolingians, symbolized by Louis V, were perceived as having failed to protect the realm and maintain order. The necessity of the state superseded the principle of hereditary right, and this brutal calculus of utility allowed Hugh Capet, who had spent decades consolidating regional power, to just step across the dynastic line.
And the transition was lightning fast, which illustrates how prepared the Capetian faction was.
Within 2 months of Louis V's hunting accident, Hugh Capet was successfully elected to the Frankish throne and crowned by Archbishop Adalberon at Senlis. The speed of the election shows the immediate consensus among the great lords and clergy that the Carolingian dynasty in West Francia was definitively over.
The man Louis V had planned to execute for treason became the kingmaker for the new line. The irony is just staggering.
It underscores the ultimate reality of power in the 10th century. Loyalty was transient, and survival was paramount. Adalberon's ultimate loyalty was not to Louis V, but to the stability of the church and the kingdom. A stability he correctly saw could only be achieved under Hugh Capet. And this ushered in the era of the Capetian dynasty, which would rule France for the next 8 centuries.
That transition from a single man falling off his horse to the crowning of a new line, all driven by a pragmatic argument for proven strength, is truly the hinge moment of French history.
It is. The weakness of one, Louis V, provided the perfect vacuum, and the competence of the other, Hugh Capet, provided the necessary solution. The vacuum was filled almost before the echo of Louis's fall had even faded.
Okay, let's synthesize all of this in our conclusion. Louis V, the legacy of Le Fainéant.
The contradiction of that nickname, it remains profound. Louis V wasn't doing nothing. His brief reign was a whirlwind of political maneuvers. High-stakes international diplomacy with the Ottonians, brutal civil factionalism, a notorious marriage scandal that wrecked his father's grand strategy.
In a final, sudden death that instantly resolved a centuries-old dynastic conflict. He was a victim of the forces he inherited, but his lack of an heir and his inability to consolidate power were the definitive catalysts.
He was caught between his mother's pro-Ottonian peace faction and the aggressive expansionists, just trying to navigate a kingdom that was already functionally split.
And his historical importance is immense, precisely because he failed. His death legitimized a process that was already in motion. The shift of real power from the weakened Carolingian crown to the great regional counts, most notably Hugh Capet.
And the fact that the transition was argued for so eloquently by powerful, learned churchmen like Adalberon and Gerbert is key. It signifies that in late 10th century Europe, the divine right of kings was becoming secondary to demonstrated political ability and military effectiveness.
The nobility and the church were exhausted by the constant turmoil and demanded an end to the weak center.
It's a profound political lesson. Monarchies sometimes fail, not through external conquest or bloody revolution, but simply because the hereditary line stops performing. When competence becomes the ruling criteria, the game is fundamentally changed.
And that leads us to the provocative final thought we want to leave you with concerning that monumental shift in political philosophy.
We've seen that the hereditary claimant, Charles of Lorraine, was sidelined. And the powerful Duke of the Franks, Hugh Capet, was chosen because he had, and I'm quoting here, proven himself through his actions and his military might.
So, we ask you to consider the foundational impact of Louis V's failure. If the collapse of the Carolingian line established the precedent that governing competence matters more than pure inherited blood, does that single incident in 987 set a critical precedent for how power would be negotiated, challenged, and justified for the entire next 800 years of the Capetian monarchy?
Was this the moment the French state began to require its monarchs to be effective managers, setting a course that would eventually lead away from pure feudalism? The do-nothing king, in his dramatic exit, fundamentally redefined what it meant to rule France.
A profound lesson in political pragmatism that shaped centuries of history. That's a wrap on this deep dive into the Carolingian swan song. We hope you feel thoroughly informed. Join us next time as we dive into another consequential corner of history.